I walked through the doors of Savona, the kind of restaurant where chandeliers dripped from the ceiling and silverware gleamed under candlelight. The kind of place where people whispered, where the clink of a glass could be heard from across the room. Tonight, though, I wasn't here as a chef. No cameras, no crew, no expectations. I just wanted to see what my restaurant had become when no one knew I was watching. A waiter, young, maybe early 20s, stood by the entrance, his uniform crisp, but his posture slack, like he had somewhere better to be. He barely looked at me before letting out a sigh, like seating me would be a chore. "Table for one?" he asked, his voice flat. I nodded. He grabbed a menu, not even glancing at me as he turned. "Right this way," he muttered, weaving through the dining room without waiting for me to follow. I could already tell. He didn't care. Not about the customers, not about the experience, not about the restaurant itself. I had spent years building Savona into something special, something where people walked away remembering not just the food, but the way they were treated. And yet, here was this kid, treating me like an afterthought. He led me past the main dining area, past the floor-to-ceiling windows with their perfect view of the city skyline, past the well-dressed couples sipping wine under the golden glow of the chandeliers. Instead, he guided me toward the back, toward the dim, quiet corners usually reserved for those who booked last minute or didn't quite fit the restaurant's image. I glanced around. Empty tables by the windows, all unoccupied. And yet, he had put me here. He dropped the menu in front of me without a word. I looked up. "Interesting spot you've chosen." The waiter, his name tag read Ethan, shrugged. "It's fine. Plenty of open tables near the front." I pointed out. He sighed again, clearly impatient. "Those are usually for—" He hesitated, giving me a once-over, eyes flicking from my plain shirt to my simple watch. "Guess who? Come here often." I stared at him. "You mean regulars?" He gave a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Yeah, sure. Regulars." Ah, there it was. A polite way of saying, "You don't belong here." I had seen this attitude before. Young waiters who thought luxury was a club, who believed certain people deserved good service, while others should feel lucky to be let in at all. It disgusted me. A restaurant, especially one like Savona, wasn't about exclusivity. It was about making every guest feel like they had walked into something special. Ethan clearly didn't believe that. He tapped the menu with his finger. "We're out a few things tonight, so don't get your hopes up." I raised an eyebrow. "No specials." He let out a small, almost mocking laugh. "Specials? Mate, this isn't some cheap diner. We don't do, secret menu stuff here." I tilted my head. "Secret menu?" "Yeah, like stuff for people who want to feel important," he said with a smirk. "We serve real food here, not frozen garbage like." He stopped, but I already knew what he was going to say. "Like whatever you're used to." I let the words settle between us. Watching his expression, the way his confidence flickered just slightly under my silence. He had no idea who I was. Not a clue. I exhaled slowly, drumming my fingers against the table. "You must know a lot about food, then." Ethan straightened a little, as if he had been waiting for the question. "Yeah," he said, puffing out his chest. "I mean, I work here, don't I? And you've tasted everything on a menu?" "Of course," he said quickly, too quickly. I picked up the menu, flipping through it. "What would you recommend?" His confidence wavered. Well, it depends. On." He shifted his weight. "On what you like. Let's say I like good food," I said simply. His eyes darted to the menu in my hands, like he was searching for an answer. Finally, he blurted the steak. I nodded. "And how is it prepared?" "Perfectly." "Perfectly," I repeated. "That's quite the answer." "Well," he said, straightening again, "our chefs are the best. You'd be lucky to eat here." "Lucky," I echoed, setting the menu down. "Tell me, Ethan, how long have you worked here?" 6 months, he said, chin lifting like that was supposed to impress me. "And in those 6 months, have you ever met the owner?" His smirk returned. "No one meets the owner. He doesn't just walk in off the street like some random guy looking for a meal." I chuckled, leaning back in my chair. "Is that so?" "Yeah," Ethan said, missing the warning in my tone. "He's a legend, a real perfectionist. If he saw someone like you," he stopped himself, but the meaning hung in the air. "Someone like me." I let the silence stretch. Let him sit in his own words. Then, finally, I smiled. You must know a lot about him then. Ethan shrugged. Enough. And what would he say if he saw how you've treated me tonight? Ethan let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. I don't think he'd care, mate. He's got bigger things to worry about than one customer. I nodded, slow, deliberate. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Ethan watched as I tapped the screen a few times, then held it up to my ear. He frowned. What are you doing? I locked eyes with him as the phone rang. A voice answered almost immediately. Chef. Ethan's smirk twitched. Marco, I said, still looking at the waiter. Come to the front. Silence. Then a hurried yes, chef. Ethan's brows pulled together. Who was that? I placed my phone back in my pocket. You'll see. He shifted his weight again, his confidence finally cracking. Look, mate, if this is about the table, But he stopped, because from across the dining room, Marco, the head chef, had just stepped into view. The moment he saw me, his entire body went rigid. His eyes widened. His lips parted slightly, as if words had momentarily left him. Ethan noticed the reaction, and for the first time all night, doubt flickered across his face. He turned back to me, his smirk on. Wait, he murmured. Who are you? I smiled, slow and measured. I didn't answer. Not yet. Let him sit in the uncertainty. Let him feel the weight of the moment, the shift in the air. And as Marco rushed toward us, his face pale, Ethan finally understood. He had made a mistake. Marco moved fast. Too fast. His footsteps cut through the low hum of the dining room, his face tight, eyes darting from me to Ethan, then back again. The moment he reached the table, he leaned in, voice just above a whisper. Chef, I held up a hand. He stopped mid-sentence, swallowing hard. I could see it in his eyes. He knew. He knew exactly what had just happened. Ethan, still standing there, still clueless, let out a nervous chuckle. Okay, what's going on? Why is... Marco turned on him so fast Ethan actually took a step back. Are you out of your mind? Marco hissed, voice low but sharp enough to cut through steel. Ethan blinked. What? Marco clenched his jaw, then exhaled through his nose. He looked like he was trying to keep himself from reaching out and shaking the kid. I leaned back, tapping my fingers against the table. Ethan here was just telling me about the owner, I said, voice light, easy, as if we were having a normal conversation. Marco flinched. He actually flinched. Ethan, to his credit, caught the reaction. His eyes flicked between us, confusion deepening. Look, mate, I didn't mean... Marco squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. You don't even... He stopped himself, took another deep breath. Then, through gritted teeth, you... Don't. Speak. Ethan shut his mouth. I picked up the menu, flipping through it like I was still deciding. Marco, tell me something. Are we out of specials tonight? Marco stiffened, then quickly shook his head. No, chef. The full menu is available. I turned to Ethan, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. That's interesting, I said, still flipping the pages. Because Ethan here told me otherwise. Marco's face darkened. Did he now? Ethan swallowed. I was just what? Marco cut in. Making things up? Deciding who deserves to know about the menu and who doesn't. Ethan said nothing. Marco turned to me, rubbing a hand over his face. Chef, I take full responsibility for this. But I wave him off. Not your mistake, I said. Not this time. Marco nodded, then turned back to Ethan. Go. Now. Kitchen. Wait for me. Ethan hesitated. But Now. Marco snapped. Ethan backed away slowly, then turned and walked toward the kitchen, shoulders stiff, face unreadable. Marco let out a breath, ran a hand through his hair. Chef, not here, I said, closing the menu. Not yet. Marco straightened. Understood. I glanced toward the kitchen doors, where Ethan had just disappeared. Let's see what he does next, I said. Let's see if he's got the guts to own his mistake. Marco nodded once tight. And if he doesn't? I looked him in the eye. Then he's done. The kitchen doors swung shut behind Ethan, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Marco exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples, his jaw tight enough to crack. He knew as well as I did that what had just happened out there wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of something much bigger. Without another word, I stood and walked toward the kitchen. Marco followed, close behind, not daring to ask what I was going to do. He didn't need to. He already knew. The second I stepped through those double doors, the atmosphere shifted. The sharp clang of pans, the sizzle of oil, the rhythmic chopping of knives. It all carried on, but there was a tension now, a stiffness in the air. The kitchen staff had seen Marco's face when he left the dining room, and now they saw mine. Heads lowered. Movements became more careful. Even the sous chefs, usually barking orders, quieted as I walked through. But Ethan, standing near the prep station, still hadn't noticed me. He was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, his face twisted in a scowl as he muttered under his breath to another waiter. "I don't get it," he was saying. "So what? He got the wrong table? I mean, it's not like I threw him out." The other waiter, a young girl, maybe 19, shifted uncomfortably. "Ethan, just stop, man." He scoffed. "Oh, come on. The guy looked like he should be eating in a pub, not in here. He's probably one of those." He turned then, and that was when he saw me. His mouth snapped shut so fast his teeth might have clicked together. I didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Ethan straightened, but I saw the nerves creeping in. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides. His Adam's apple bobbed. But then, just as quickly, his face hardened again, like he was convincing himself he hadn't done anything wrong. I took a step forward. The kitchen was so quiet now you could hear the bubbling of a distant stock pot. "You seem to have a lot to say, Ethan," I said. "Go on then. Finish your sentence." Ethan hesitated. I tilted my head slightly. "No, nothing else to add." He cleared his throat. I didn't mean anything by it." "Didn't mean anything by what?" He licked his lips. I thought." "You thought," I said, stepping closer, "that you could decide who deserves good service and who doesn't." Ethan stiffened. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," I said. "It was clear the moment you opened your mouth." Marco, still behind me, let out a slow breath through his nose. The other waiters and kitchen staff weren't even pretending to work anymore. They were watching, waiting. I stared at Ethan for a long moment, letting him sit in his own silence. I finally said, "I built this place from the ground up." Ethan blinked. Every tile, every chair, every plate, every knife, every single thing in this restaurant was chosen for a reason. I took another step forward, and I hired people who understood what that reason was. Ethan's throat bobbed again. I don't care where a person comes from," I cut in. "I don't care how they dress, what they do, how much money they have. If they walk through those doors, they're a guest. And you," I jabbed a finger at his chest, "just made a guest feel like they didn't belong." His eyes darted to Marco, as if hoping for some kind of lifeline. He wasn't going to find one. "But I didn't know who you were," Ethan blurted. I let the words hang there. Then I smiled. Not a kind smile. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" I said softly. "If you had known, would you have treated me differently?" Ethan's face paled slightly. I leaned in just enough that only he could hear the next part. "If the answer is yes," I murmured, "then you're in the wrong business." His breath hitched. I straightened. The entire kitchen was watching, waiting for the hammer to drop. I exhaled slowly. "Ethan," I said, "take off your apron." His eyes widened. "Wait, please, Now," I said. He hesitated, just for a second, then reached up, fumbling with the ties behind his back. His hands were shaking. I turned to Marco. "Get him out of my kitchen," I said. And just like that, it was over. The kitchen doors swung shut behind Ethan, and the weight of what had just happened settled into the room like a thick fog. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sounds were the steady bubbling of sauces and the rhythmic ticking of the overhead ventilation fans. Marco stood beside me, his arms stiff at his sides, jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Across the kitchen, the other chefs and wait staff glanced at each other, exchanging silent looks. Ethan was gone. But the problem? The problem was still here. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair. "How long has this been going on?" Marco hesitated, then glanced toward the others. A few of the younger chefs avoided my gaze. I turned to Marco, my voice sharper this time. "How long?" "A while," he admitted, lowering his voice. "Ethan's not the only one. It's been creeping in bit by bit. So the new staff, they don't get it, chef. They don't understand what this place is supposed to be. I took a step forward, letting my eyes scan the room. Some of these faces I recognized. Some I didn't. But they all worked in my kitchen, my restaurant. And I could see it now. The ones who stood straighter, more disciplined, the ones who respected the craft, and the ones who didn't. The ones who had been getting away with things for far too long. I nodded slowly. All right, I said, voice calm, steady. Then it's time they learn. Marco shifted. What are you thinking? I glanced toward the main dining room, where customers were still eating, still drinking, still completely unaware of what was happening back here. Then I turned back to my team. They don't know who I am. I said, fine. I picked up an apron from a nearby hook, slinging it over my head. Let's show them. Marco's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't question me. Instead, he simply nodded. Yes, chef. I turned to the staff. I want every plate that leaves this kitchen to be perfect. No shortcuts. No mistakes. If you wouldn't serve it to me, you don't serve it at all. Understood. A few nervous nods. Louder, I snapped. Yes, chef, they answered in unison. Good, I said, rolling on my sleeves. Now, let's get to work. I moved to the nearest station, grabbing a cutting board. The energy in the kitchen shifted instantly. Some watched in shock, some in excitement, but all of them understood one thing. The owner wasn't just watching anymore. He was in the trenches with them, and things were about to change. The first thing I noticed was the shift in energy. It wasn't just about me stepping into the kitchen. It was the way the room divided itself. Some of them were eager, ready to prove themselves. Others not so much. I saw it in the way certain chefs avoided eye contact, how a few of the waiters whispered to each other when they thought I wasn't looking. Ethan may have been gone, but he wasn't the only problem. Marco stood beside me, his hands on his hips, scanning the kitchen the same way I was. He saw it too. I tied the apron tighter, cracked my knuckles, and grabbed a knife. Let's go, I said. For the first 10 minutes, everything ran smoothly. Orders came in, dishes went out, and the team moved efficiently. But then, little things started happening. A steak came back undercooked. Then another one was overcooked. A sauce wasn't reduced properly. A garnish was missing. I caught it all, and I knew exactly what was happening. Some of them were testing me. I watched as one of the younger chefs, a guy named Leo, sent out a dish that looked like it had been plated by a 5-year-old. The smear of puree was sloppy, the protein was sitting in a puddle of its own juices, and the garnish was barely holding on. I picked up the plate, turned it slightly, then set it back down. Leo, I called. He turned, wiping his hands on his apron. Yes, chef. I pointed at the plate. Would you eat that? Leo hesitated. Would you eat it? I repeated, sharper this time. He swallowed. No, chef. Then why are you serving it to a guest? He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. I picked up the plate and held it up for everyone to see. This, I said, is what happens when you stop caring. This is what happens when you think you can get away with just doing the bare minimum. The room was silent. I turned back to Leo. Fix it. Now. Yes, chef, he mumbled, grabbing the plate and moving quickly to replate the dish properly. Marco stepped up beside me, lowering his voice. They're pushing back. I know, I said, my voice low, and I'm pushing harder. But it didn't stop there. A few of the waitstaff were still whispering, still throwing glances my way, still acting like I wasn't meant to be here. I caught one of them, a server named Ryan, rolling his eyes as he walked past. Ryan, I called out. He paused, turned halfway, eyebrows raised. Yes. I stepped forward, keeping my voice calm but firm. Got something to say? He hesitated for a second, then shrugged. Just seems like a lot of fuss over one mistake. One mistake. I let those words sink in for a moment. Then I nodded slowly. All right, I said. Let's talk about that. I turned to the entire kitchen, raising my voice slightly. Anyone else feel the same way? That what happened tonight wasn't a big deal. No one answered. Come on, I said, scanning the room. Speak up. If you think I overreacted, say it now. A long silence. Then, slowly, Ryan crossed his arms. It's just people mess up sometimes. Doesn't mean they should get thrown out. I nodded again. You're right. People mess up. But do you know what separates a good restaurant from a great one? Ryan didn't answer. I stepped closer. It's not about the mistake. It's about how you handle it. Ethan? He didn't own his mistake. He doubled down on it. And if you don't understand why that's a problem, then maybe you're standing in the wrong kitchen. Ryan's face reddened slightly. He looked away, muttering something under his breath. But I was done playing games. If anyone here thinks this restaurant is just another job, I said, my voice cutting through the air, then you're free to leave. Right now, no hard feelings. But if you stay, you work my way. With respect, with discipline, with the understanding that every single person who walks through that door deserves the best. Silence. No one moved. Then Marco stepped forward. You heard, chef, he said, voice firm. Decide now. 1 second passed, then another, and then, finally, Ryan untied his apron, tossed it onto a nearby counter, and walked out without another word. The doors swung shut behind him. I took a deep breath, letting the moment settle. Then I turned back to the team. Anyone else? No one spoke. No one moved. Good, I said, adjusting my sleeves. Then let's get back to work. The moment Ryan walked out, the air in the kitchen felt different, tighter, like a thread pulled just a little too far. Everyone was waiting for what would happen next, watching me, watching Marco, waiting for something to break the silence. I took a slow breath, exhaled, then turned back to the pass. Orders up, I called. Let's move. And just like that, the kitchen came back to life. Pans clattered, knives chopped. The low murmur of voices returned as plates were prepped and sent out. But even with things running, I could feel the weight of what had just happened. Not everyone agreed with me. Some of them were still questioning whether I'd made the right call. I could see it in the way a few of the younger chefs glanced toward the door, their minds elsewhere. I needed to make something clear. I turned to Marco. I want Ethan brought back in. Marco's brow furrowed. Chef, you heard me, I said, wiping my hands on a towel. Get him back here. Marco hesitated, then nodded and disappeared through the kitchen doors. The staff around me exchanged glances, confused. No one said anything, but I knew what they were thinking. Why bring him back after everything? 10 minutes passed. Then the doors swung open again, and Ethan stepped inside. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room like he wasn't sure if this was a setup. Marco was behind him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I set my knife down and stepped forward. Ethan stood stiffly, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Why am I here? He asked, voice cautious. I didn't answer right away. I just let the moment stretch, watching him, reading him. Do you know why I fired you? I finally asked. Ethan swallowed. Because I insulted you. Wrong, I said. Try again. He hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know. Yes, you do, I said. You just don't want to say it. He looked down, jaw clenched. I sighed. You insulted a guest, Ethan. You made a snap judgment about someone based on how they looked. And then, when you realized your mistake, you didn't own it. You try to cover it up, justify it. That's why you're standing here. Ethan's throat bobbed. I messed up, he admitted. For the first time, I asked. He hesitated. No, he said quietly. There it was. The kitchen was silent again, the staff hanging onto every word. I took a step closer. So now you've got two choices, I said. You can walk out that door again and keep making the same mistake somewhere else. Or you can stay, take the hit, and learn from it. Ethan blinked. You're offering me my job back? He asked, his voice filled with disbelief. No, I said. I'm offering you a second chance. Your job? That's something you'll have to earn back. Ethan looked at Marco, then at the other staff. Some of them looked confused. Some of them looked angry. But no one said a word. He took a shaky breath. Then he nodded. Okay, he said. Good, I said. Now grab an apron and get to work. And just like that, the fire was back. The second Ethan tied on an apron, the tension in the room snapped tight. The other chefs didn't say anything, but I could see it in their faces. Some of them didn't like this. They didn't think he deserved another chance. And maybe they were right. But I wasn't here to hand out easy lessons. Ethan stood at the prep station, shoulders tense, eyes darting around like he was waiting for someone to tell him this was all a joke. But no one did. Instead, Marco shoved a cutting board in front of him. Start prepping the shallots, Marco said. His voice was sharp, no room for argument. Ethan nodded, grabbing a knife. But as soon as he started cutting, I could see the problem. His movements were stiff, hesitant. He was second-guessing himself. I stepped up behind him. That's not how you hold a knife. He flinched slightly, adjusting his grip. Faster, I said. He picked up the pace, but the slices were uneven. Some too thick, some too thin. Again, I ordered. Ethan exhaled sharply, but did as he was told. This time, his hands were shaking slightly. The rest of the kitchen moved around him, everyone focused on their tasks, but I knew they were all paying attention. Watching him. Watching me. He finished slicing the shallots, but before he could step back, Marco picked up a handful and let them fall back onto the board. Not even, Marco said. Do it again. Ethan's jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly before he reached for another shallot. I saw the frustration in his face. He wanted to argue, to snap back, but he didn't. He just kept slicing. For the next hour, he did nothing but prep. Shallots, garlic, herbs, peeling potatoes, washing lettuce. The basic tasks, the ones a first-year apprentice would do. And the kitchen, it ran like a machine around him. Orders flew in, plates went out, and every single person in that room was proving why they were here. Ethan, though, he was struggling. At one point, he reached for a pan, moving too fast, and almost knocked over a tray of delicate garnishes. Marco caught it before it spilled. Slow down, Marco said, voice tight. You're not helping if you make more problems. Ethan muttered something under his breath. I turned toward him. What was that? His back stiffened. Nothing, chef. Not nothing, I said. Say it. He hesitated. Then, finally, he looked up. This is pointless, he said, voice low but steady. I'm just chopping things while everyone else actually cooks. The room went silent. I crossed my arms. You think this is pointless? Ethan swallowed, but he didn't back down. I just don't see how this proves anything. Then you haven't learned a thing, I said. I stepped closer. You think cooking is just about fancy plating and expensive ingredients? About standing in front of a stove and flipping steaks? No, it's about discipline, about respect. For the food, for the team, for the craft. Ethan didn't answer. I picked up a handful of the shallots he'd just cut and held them up. This, I said, this is the foundation. If you can't do the basics perfectly, you can't do anything. Ethan's hands curled into fists. You don't like this? I asked. Good. You're not supposed to. Growth isn't comfortable. It's supposed to make you angry. But if you walk away now, that's all you'll ever be. Angry. Stuck in the same place. So decide. Ethan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Then, slowly, he reached for another shallot. And he kept cutting. The kitchen never stopped moving. Orders flew in, dishes went out, and every second counted. But in the middle of it all, Ethan stood at his station, slicing shallots with a kind of quiet determination I hadn't seen before. He wasn't perfect. His hand still shook now and then. His pace was a little too cautious. But he was trying, not just to do the work, but to do it right. I watched as Marco walked past, glancing at Ethan's prep. Without saying a word, Marco reached down, picked up one of the shallot slices, and inspected it. Then, instead of tossing them back on the board like before, he gave a small nod and walked away. Ethan saw it, and I knew that meant something. The night pushed forward. Dishes went out flawlessly, course after course. The team was sharp, in sync, working like a well-oiled machine. But I could still feel it, the tension, the doubt from some of them. They were waiting for Ethan to slip up. And then it happened. A sudden shout from the line. Refire on table 7. Lamb's over. Head snapped toward the pass. A server was standing there, holding a plate with a perfectly plated lamb dish, but the meat was cooked past medium, a mistake that couldn't go out. The chef responsible cursed under his breath, yanking off his gloves. I need 6 minutes for another one. Marco was already moving, grabbing another lamb loin to start the refire. But 6 minutes in a packed kitchen felt like a lifetime. Then Ethan spoke up. I can do it, he said, voice steady. The room froze for half a second. Marco turned, raising an eyebrow. What? Ethan swallowed hard, but didn't back down. I can do it, he repeated. I know the station. I trained on it before I was moved to front of house. Marco glanced at me. I looked at Ethan. You sure? Yes, chef, he said. I studied him. He wasn't cocky. He wasn't desperate. He was just ready. I nodded once. Do it. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved to the station, grabbed a fresh cut of lamb, seasoned it, and set it on the heat. The other chefs stepped back slightly, giving him space, but their eyes stayed locked on him. The kitchen wasn't forgiving. One mistake, and they'd eat him alive. He worked quickly, searing the lamb with precision, basting it in butter, checking the temperature with the same touch I'd taught every chef in this kitchen. When the meat was ready, he let it rest while he plated the sides, careful, focused, precise. Then, with a deep breath, he sliced into the lamb. Perfect medium rare. Without a word, he plated it, wiped the edges clean, and set it on the pass. Lamb, table 7, he called. Marco checked the dish, gave a single nod, and sent it out. Silence. Then, slowly, the kitchen shifted. The other chefs exchanged glances. Some of them gave small nods. Others just went back to work, but something was different now. Ethan wasn't just here anymore. He belonged. I stepped forward, lowering my voice. You still think this is pointless? Ethan met my eyes. No, chef. Good, I said. Because this is only the beginning. Thank you for listening to another exciting story from VIP Vault. If you have enjoyed listening to this story, check out our videos here.